Okay, so picture this. You wake up one morning and you decide to check your investments, and all the gains that you've made since like a major political event are just gone, like poof, now vanish. If you want to understand how decisions about global trade can actually have a real impact on your own life and the entire economy, then hit that like button and subscribe. We're going to take a deep dive into tariffs and market reactions. So first, a quick explanation. Tariffs are basically taxes on imported goods, right? And President Trump, his goal was to protect American industries and jobs. But the reaction from the financial world was pretty dramatic. There was this huge sell-off that wiped out all the stock market gains made since his election. Yeah, all the major stock indexes like the S&P 500, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and the NASDAQ, they all took a pretty big hit. The Dow, for example, dropped something like 580 points. And it wasn't just limited to the U.S. market either. European markets also saw some sharp declines as well. So what exactly were these tariffs? Well, imports from Canada and Mexico were hit with a 25% tax. And then on top of that, Canadian energy products faced an additional 10% import duty. And the tariff on Chinese imports, that was doubled from 10% to 20%. Now, these targeted countries, they didn't just sit there and do nothing, right? China recaled you with tariffs of up to 15% on some key U.S. agricultural products, things like chicken, pork, soybeans, and beef. And they also made it harder for U.S. companies to do business there. Canada also fought back with retaliatory tariffs on over $100 billion worth of American goods. And Mexico also jumped in with their own set of tariffs on U.S. imports. This whole back-and-forth exchange of tariffs, it really raised concerns for businesses and economists. Big retailers like Target and Best Buy warned that their profits could be affected because of the increased costs from these tariffs. Best Buy stock actually dropped by almost 14% after they released a weaker earnings forecast, and they specifically mentioned tariff concerns as a factor. The big worry was that these tariffs could start this chain reaction. It could push up consumer prices and rebound inflation, which would be bad news for the economy and for Wall Street. And here's where things get even more interesting. All of this was happening at a time when the economy was already kind of shaky. Consumers, who were already dealing with rising inflation, were starting to be more careful with their money and cut back on spending. Layoffs were increasing, consumer confidence was dropping, and inflation was already higher than the Federal Reserve's target of 2%. Throwing tariffs into this mix, well, it was kind of like adding fuel to the fire. There was a real concern that tariffs could actually slow down economic growth and make a bad situation even worse. But even with all this anxiety, experts didn't all agree on what was going to happen. Some people argued that these tariffs were really just a way for the Trump administration to get better trade deals, a negotiating tactic. They pointed to what's happened in the past, saying that investing when the market gets after a single-day decline has often been a good move. However, the market's really strong negative reaction to these tariffs suggested that maybe things were different this time. It seemed like investors were starting to realize that these tariffs weren't just empty threats. They were a real policy that was being put into action, and this realization set a wave of fear through the financial world. Making things even more uncertain were warnings from organizations like the International Chamber of Commerce. They were saying that these increasing trade tensions could spiral out of control and potentially create a really damaging economic situation, similar to the devastating trade war of the 1930s. In the middle of all of this, President Trump gave a speech to Congress where he talked about the renewal of the American dream, but his optimistic message seemed to clash with the growing worries about what was going to happen with the economy. The Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta's real-time GDP forecast even suggested that the economy might actually shrink. This prediction added to the concerns about the impact of the tariffs. It showed that the tariffs might not only hurt certain industries, but they could also drag down the entire U.S. economy. If you're liking this deep dive into the complicated world of tariffs and market reactions, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to get more. And to make things even more complicated, there were other things going on in the U.S. economy. Consumers were already dealing with rising inflation, and they were starting to cut back on their spending a little bit. Layoffs were going up, consumer confidence was going down, and inflation was already higher than that 2% target set by the Federal Reserve. So adding these tariffs into this mix that was already kind of fragile, well, it was like throwing gasoline on the fire, right? There was this real worry that tariffs could actually make economic growth even slower and make an already bad situation worse. But even with all this worry going around, the experts didn't all agree on what was going to happen. Some people thought that the tariffs were mainly a negotiating tactic, something the Trump administration was using to try and get better trade deals. It pointed to what had happened before in history and said that investing when the market dips after one of those single-day declines has often turned out to be a good move. But then again, the market had a really strong negative reaction to these tariffs, which suggested that maybe this time things were different. It seemed like investors were starting to realize that these tariffs weren't just some empty threats. This was a real policy that was actually being put into action. And that realization sent a wave of fear through the whole financial world. Organizations like the International Chamber of Commerce, they also added to the uncertainty. They warned that these increasing trade tensions could spiral out of control, and that could lead to a really damaging economic situation similar to that trade war back in the 1930s, which had really bad consequences consequences for the whole world. Right in the middle of all this, President Trump gave a speech to Congress where he talked about the renewal of the American dream. But his message of being optimistic, it didn't really match up with all the growing worries about what was going to happen to the economy. And then the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, their real-time GDP forecast even suggested that the economy might actually shrink, which just added to the concerns about the impact of these tariffs. This prediction showed how these tariffs could not only hurt specific industries, but also have a bigger negative impact on the entire U.S. economy. Putting these tariffs in place and in seeing how the targeted countries fought back really showed how connected the global economy is. Decisions made in one part of the world can have some pretty significant and often unexpected consequences in other parts of the world. It also showed how actions taken by politicians can disrupt financial markets and create a lot of economic uncertainty. So yeah, the Trump tariffs and all the reactions they caused in the markets, they really showed us how big of an impact global trade decisions can have. It's not just about numbers on a screen, it's about real consequences for everyone, not just the Wall Street experts. What do you think about all of this? What do you think the long-term effects of these tariffs are going to be? Will they eventually lead to new trade deals, or could this be the beginning of a really bad trade war? This is really just the start of the story, and nobody knows for sure what's going to happen. If you thought this deep dive was interesting, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more in-depth looks at these kinds of complex topics. We'll keep looking at the effects of these major events and try to help you understand the complicated world we live in.